If you go to a doctor, you have to either believe the doctor or go to another doctor. And that's the choice of a parent. They have to make that decision. But the doctor doesn't necessarily have to change the way they operate because you don't like it.
Welcome to Acton Line, a product of the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. I'm Eric Kohn, executive producer. In 2007, Thales Academy was born with a simple vision: provide an excellent and affordable education for students in pre-K to 12th grades through the use of direct instruction and a classical curriculum that embodies traditional American values. Thales provides a rigorous academic environment that fosters ethical behavior, critical thinking, virtuous leadership, lifelong learning, and truth-seeking, with a firm foundation in cognitive, non-cognitive, and technical skills. As a result, Thales Academy students are well prepared to succeed in higher education, career, and life while positively impacting the world around them. In the Thales Way, Robert L. Luddy, the founder of Thales Academy and several other schools, as well as the entrepreneur behind the industry-leading kitchen ventilation system company Captive Air, elaborates on the history and mission of Thales Academy, explaining the rationale for their educational approaches and standards and methods for teachers, students, and families. Today, I talk with Bob Luddy about his vision for Thales, his long-run involvement in developing educational alternatives to traditional public schools, the importance of character formation in educational instruction, and his approach to entrepreneurialism evident in both Thales and Captive Air. Robert L. Luddy is a business and educational entrepreneur. A graduate of LaSalle University and a U.S. Army veteran, Luddy purchased a sheet metal shop in 1981 and transformed it into Captive Air Systems, the leading manufacturer of commercial kitchen ventilation systems in North America. However, Bob Luddy is more than just a businessman. He's a champion for children's education and a school choice advocate. In 1998, Bob established Franklin Academy, a public charter school in Wake Forest, which now serves over 1,200 K-12 students. In 2001, Bob founded St. Thomas More Academy, a private Catholic college preparatory high school in Raleigh, North Carolina. And in 2007, Bob opened Thales Academy, a growing chain of independent pre- to K-12 schools, offering high-quality education at an affordable tuition. The Luddy schools are quickly growing, with nearly 3,000 students enrolled throughout the Raleigh area. Luddy is the author of the book, The Thales Way, which we'll be discussing today. You can find additional resources in the show notes for this episode, as well as find previous episodes of Acton Line on our website at acton.org/actonline. And if you like this program, you can help us reach even more listeners by sharing it with a friend and leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. We welcome your comments as well. Acton Line is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Bob Luddy, welcome to Acton Line.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Bob, we recently here at Acton, we published a piece reviewing a book by you, The Thales Way, which is about your vision for education and Thales Academy in particular. Take a few minutes and tell us what is the book about, and tell us about Thales Academy and this view on education.
Thales was established in 2007, and the idea was to have a private K-12 school, actually a chain of schools, using direct instruction in K-5, which is one of the best methodologies of teaching reading, math, and phonics, and then preparing students to go into classic studies in the 6-12. The advantage of the classic studies, as I simplistically describe it, is learning from the masters over the last 2,500 years. So classic students learn how to think, question, wonder. They become good communicators, and they gain some of the wisdom. So the old Greeks were seeking wisdom. So classical studies is seeking wisdom, not just knowledge and information. And So gradually we've expanded to 13 campuses, 6,200 students. So the public has received this offering very well, and we're not controlled by arcane government regulations, new math, and a sundry of other things that have come along over the years that really don't make a lot of sense.
What helped identify for you this need in the educational space? And I've heard more and more in recent years about classical style education and people who are opting for something different than what not only public schools have been offering, but what a lot of private schools previously had been offering. What drew you to this model and approach to education?
I think one thing in the experience of Captive Air, a company I established 47 years ago, in order for us to compete in the market, we need to continuously gain new knowledge, rethink what we're doing, create new technology. Excuse me. And there's a tendency with schooling that you go to school, you learn something, and then you learn how to do it, and then that's what you do. But we're in a very dynamic world of continuous change. So what really needs to come out of school is learning the ability, learn what you can, learn how to learn, and develop the wonder and curiosity to keep learning your entire life, because that's the only way that you can make a contribution. Otherwise, you're just regurgitating information, and it tends to put people 20, 30 years behind where we're at. And you see industry, it permeates into industries where they just fall behind, and then sometimes they're just taken out by new upstarts. So the prime thing we're trying to get to is wonder, thinking, curiosity, and following the path of a dynamic world the way God created it.
So the direct instruction that you were talking about, and that's up through what grade?
Fifth grade.
Up through fifth grade. Including fifth grade. For anyone in our audience, just to clarify, what would characterize that kind of instruction?
Okay, so direct instruction is both a curriculum and it's also a methodology of teaching. And this methodology has been developed over the last 50 plus years. So you have, first of all students pay attention at all times. You don't have students not paying attention. There's a lot of repeated responses, both in groups and individually. Teachers will recite the correct way of pronunciation, how to read a paragraph properly. And what it does is students learn, first of all, it's fun for them in this process. They learn how to be good readers. They pronounce words correctly. They learn how to spell using phonics. So a number of things are going on at one time. They're developing a discipline, how to learn, actually learning, and then when they get the basics down, so now they can read well, they can do basic computations. They're ready to move into more complex, which sixth grade Latin, rhetoric, etc.
For classical education, so I hear this, as I said, I think this is getting talked a lot more about these days. I hear more about it. I've got a fourth grader and a seventh grader, heard more about it as we were entertaining possibilities for their education. Describe for everyone what is all wrapped up in a classical approach to education.
Well, it begins by learning all the way back to the Greek. So reading good literature, learning how to write well, getting a deep sense of history all the way back to 500 BC. As a matter of fact, Thales was alive in 500 BC, and the namesake Thales is used because he was one of the first recognized scientists in the Greek world. So there's many things that the Greeks taught us, beginning with geometry, how to think, how to question. Forward to the Romans, improved on it. And throughout 2,000 years, we continue to improve. But it's essentially learning from the masters of thought, literature, history, philosophy, over 2,500 years, as opposed to, some schools start history in 1860. Well, what happened before that? They just don't know. Many of them don't even know about the Revolutionary War, much less what happened to the Roman Empire. How did Greece affect Rome? All these things are important in having a deep understanding of Western civilization and be able to think through future problems based on the way they're solved in the past.
Well, I think you also have, you were kind of alluding to this a moment ago, but you mark some of those big moments in American history, and there's a whole lot that's still, left on the table. I mean, I've found students don't learn a whole lot about, the early 20th century, the history of the progressive movement, what led us up to involvement in World War I and World War II. So, anything giving us a deeper perspective just on that recent history, let alone kind of the history of the world and where the concept of the pursuit of knowledge comes from. It's probably a marked departure from the kind of education that most students in this country are getting currently.
Yeah, and what it does, it allows them to analyze and understand future problems in truth and reality, as opposed to what I call thematic. We're saving the planet, so anything we say that saves the planet, we do. I mean, it moves to a point of insanity and stupidity because nothing's questioned. Whereas a classical student is going to question everything. They're going to want to understand Greek history and where geometry came from and what Aristotle told us, the truth and the good, and how Thomas Aquinas viewed all that. These are contextually extraordinarily important for all students to understand. And essentially, we've deprived them of that. And if you look at our modern culture, it's reflective in modern culture. They've just abandoned the truth, the good, and the beautiful. I just threw it out willy-nilly.
This was not your first venture into education. I know in 1998, you established Franklin Academy in Wake Forest, and have also found St. Thomas More Academy, which is a private Catholic college preparatory high school in Raleigh, North Carolina. What spurred you personally to want to get involved in the education space?
I guess a couple things. I went to Catholic school in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, from 1st through 12th grade when there was no cost to the family. So if you were in a parish, you could go to the schools. And that allowed us to get a pretty good education when otherwise going to the public school would have been not near as good and a little bit more dangerous even back in that time frame. So then fast forward and then I went to Catholic college. So the current time, I realized that employees come into captive air. In some cases, it's almost hard to believe, but people working in the shop, they couldn't do decimals. So if you said, or fractions, cut the metal 12 on an 8, they couldn't do it because they had no concept of fractions. And then I saw so many individuals, both young and also adults, that being deprived of a reasonable education gave them somewhat miserable lives because they didn't know how to handle all the challenges that came forward to them. So we tried to help our employees, teach them, ditto. But at some point I became very mad, the fact that we say we love our kids and we have public education, but we don't do it. And it made me very mad. And that's what pushed me to say, I'm going to do something about it. And, as an entrepreneur, we tend to say, we don't talk about things, we do things.
Well, talk about a little what you just referenced there with your own personal education. You're able to get, as you said, a good education when the situation was, if you're a member of the parish, you were able to get it at no direct cost to your family. What do you feel that your education there really prepared you for success in life? And what lessons do you try to draw on from your own educational experience in terms of the application to Franklin Academy, to St. Thomas More, and now to Thales schools?
Well, one in particular, so for the time from when I was in the fourth grade forward, I walked to school. It was about 3/4 of a mile. And so from the third to eighth grade, I had the experience of walking with my buddies to school. So we made friends. We did pickup basketball games. And by the time I was in the sixth grade, I picked up little jobs. I picked up a paper route. And then I worked in the school cafeteria, so I was the head dishwasher. So I learned how to wash these dishes commercially very fast. So informally, I was also gaining really good vocational skills, which turned out to be important later on in starting the company. In high school, I would say we weren't as classical as our schools would be today, but it was basically a classical education. We were pushed to a higher level, same way in college. And my father made the case that, okay, I majored in finance in college. He said, when you get one degree, his degree was in mathematics, then you start working on your next skill set. So in his case, he learned engineering. And gradually I had good vocational skills, and I started becoming interested in physics and engineering. So even though I have no formal training, I started a technology company. But I have good informal skills, of which initially I learned from my parents, but I also learned in school how to learn, how to dig and get truthful information. And if there's one skill Captive Air has, we know how to dig hard to get truthful information and to continuously improve. And that's something I want to bring to the students. I might add that we're in a more modern era, so the direct instruction is a superior curriculum to what I went through. We're also working on making sure that every student is engaged in some level of vocational education. And more recently, we're actually working on this right now. And I've got a reference from Eastern Europe. We want to stimulate interest in science, math, physics, etc., at a very young age, so that when they get into high school, they're not intimidated when they're told they're going to take physics or biology. They're actually going to know something about it. They're going to know some of the terminology, and it's going to have a comfort level to them. Whereas in my case, when I took physics in high school, I didn't know what physics was. And so that doesn't stimulate the interest you need. So we're bringing a lot of things into the school. We're in a more modern age. We have more financial capabilities. And recently there was a book I was reading. I'll get the reference that those early years, those K-8 years are really important. And very often to be fair, they're vastly underutilized. I know from my own grandchildren, children are smart, and if you're handling them correctly, they can learn a tremendous amount of information at a very young age. So they may be young, but they have good minds. We have to develop those minds and this book is something like about hidden potential. Every student has hidden potential. Sometimes it's hard to recognize, but we have to use every ways and means possible to recognize their potential and then help them to reach their ultimate goals.
One of the things I hear coming through there as well is a cultivation of a culture of learning, which is something that I think even for me, I didn't really get inculcated in myself until college, whereas it really only took someone suggesting like some of the classes that you have to take in college, general education, in order to get a degree. I was like, well, just, learn it for the joy of learning something new. And I think a lot of primary education and even to high school is, like you said, not even knowing anything about or what physics was going into it. There it's often seems to me to lack the environment that pushes people to you may not know it, you may not understand the value, but you can understand and be part of a community that finds the joy in learning things for the sake of learning them and for the knowledge that will bring.
Yes. There's also, if you look at our schools, we say we de-emphasize sports. So we do have basketball, we don't have football, some soccer, but we don't let sports become the culture of the school. Because when they become the culture of the school, it's the most important thing. And then academics falls to the second level. That's just a hard reality in my mind. I know many people feel like you end up becoming a better leader, team person if you play sports, but I didn't. I played pickup sports with my buddies, but I didn't play for any teams. There's also extensive evidence that students need to learn things on their own, do their own pickup basketball game, make their own whatever they do, learn how to handle a paper route and collect the money. Those experiences are very important to the future of dealing with individuals, knowing how to approach problems, and as an adult, dealing with things that are more complex. And in a highly structured, we eliminate all that. Mom drives you somewhere, you go, you take a course, but you don't have to do anything on your own except follow instructions. In the world I live in, there are no instructions. And if you look at our senior engineer people, our sales engineers, people in all aspects of the company, there are no instructions. You need to figure out a better, more efficient way of doing things. And you need to have a steep learning curve, or you are literally falling behind every single day. And ultimately, you're not going to be successful.
One of the things that you mentioned there about the difference between organized team sports and pickup sports is one of the things that I think I've noticed about the state of education currently is the amount of appeals that are often made to authority within schools. We don't let kids resolve certain conflicts themselves. There's this immediate turn to looking for some kind of an adult or an authority figure to solve the problem for them, which I think to me kind of speaks to the difference in talking about, pickup games versus organized games. Well, there's always somebody and there's a value to this, of course. The organization, the officiating, the coaching that exists in a team sports level versus I played inline hockey with friends, only ever played pickup games. It forces you to organize things yourself, to figure out how to solve conflicts yourself. You don't even need sports necessarily to do this, right? Just even being on the playground, not having an adult around who you can immediately appeal to solve your problem for you forces you to learn how to figure these things out amongst yourselves. And it seems like this is encouraging of that kind of approach, which we need as humans. We need to be able to figure out how to solve conflicts amongst ourselves without someone interceding, but we don't seem to get a lot of that anymore.
It's just been totally abandoned along with vocational education. Why would they throw vocational education out of schools? Because somebody decided everybody goes to college, but who makes the stuff and who services it? It just makes no sense at all. I wanted to make a point. When I started Captive Air, I started with no money, and I was going to sell and install fire suppression systems in restaurants. So I had to be the first installer. I've never done it before. I had about three days and said, I got to figure out how to do it, and I did it. If I had no confidence or no skills, this company doesn't start. So my thought is, I don't care how intellectual you are. You might want to have a garden. You might want to have a hobby. Start developing those skills at a young age. Because I noticed this with my dad. He was a very intellectual person, mathematician, but he liked to do simple things because you need a little break from the math and the engineering at times. We're not encouraging that because somehow people have in their mind, I'm intellectual, I don't need vocational skills. Well, in the modern world, there's nobody to fix many of the problems that you have. Your toilet doesn't work, either fix it yourself or wait until next week. recently I was reading a book that written about Home Depot. They created a whole new industry where people taught themselves vocational skills. And it's really a beautiful thing that they did. And if they didn't do it, people would, there wouldn't be enough service people to remotely solve the problems that existed out there.
There is that fascinating culture that has emerged around, the Home Depot oriented DIY stuff where, for people like me who were never taught a lot of that, there's a YouTube video for it, right? So like you end up finding an example and, yes, somebody's showing you by example, but you're teaching yourself because the only way to really learn it is to do it on your own.
Yeah, another thing we were discussing last week, you can learn a concept in college or in school, and you can understand it perfectly intellectually. It doesn't mean you can do it. There's a whole nother step there that's missing. I want to bring some of those steps into school where, to the extent possible, like we have a program in 912 where you can do 1 hour of engineering every day for 4 years. It's called Luddy Institute of Technology. And that includes woodworking, electrical, mechanical, robotics, the whole range of things. We actually had a student a couple of years ago. They have a senior project required, and he asked if he could buy a 1974 Honda and completely redo it. And I came in at the end of the project. I looked at this thing and I said, well, it looks like a brand new bike, but somehow I'm looking at it, it can't be a brand new bike. And here's what happened. A 74 bike, many of the parts don't exist anymore. So you had to find ways and means of finding the part or creating some bypass around that part. And I thought, this is exactly what we're trying to accomplish. This is the best case. Now, he did have some experience vocationally with motorbikes. Nonetheless, going into college, he could take a bike from nothing and redo it on his own with minimal help from anybody.
You reminded me in the beginning there of the joke about the University of Chicago. I used to live right south of the University of Chicago. They'd always say, well, it works in practice, but does it work in theory? Right. So like we found these things that work in the real world, but now we need to deconstruct the theory of them. And again, there's a role for a lot of these things, but I think you're right that we tend to orient so much towards the intellectual understanding without the applicational understanding of it. Talk to me a little bit about starting Captive Air. You've mentioned Captive Air a few times. So tell us about the company, about starting it. And then if you could also draw it connected to the educational approach, and one of the things I was hearing in there strikes me as what I was told about entrepreneurialism, that it is a combination of innate and learned skills. Like anybody who's known, I have a friend who's a serial entrepreneur. There are just some people who are inclined to be like those. They come up with ideas and want to try to execute them. But there are certain skills that you can develop along the way that make what's innate about you better. So tell us about Captive Air, how you came about starting the business, what the business does, and the importance of, I think, teaching these entrepreneurial skills to people through an educational model.
We've had a lot of discussion on, can you teach entrepreneurship? And I think the answer is no, you cannot teach it. What you can do is you can provide certain skill sets and certain economic theory that they can try to apply in the marketplace. But the instincts of an entrepreneur, as you mentioned, are their own instincts. And some people have them and some don't. Also, it requires risk-taking. So I started this business. I had one child that was less than a year old when I started the business. So I'm taking a big risk leaving my job. I've got no money. And I decided I'm going to be a one-man band for a while. I'll sell, I'll install, etc. Well, within a couple of months, I hired somebody. And then within 6 months, we were not only installing the fire suppression system, we were installing a ventilation system. Now, when we first did that, we didn't know anything about ventilation systems, zero. So we got the code books, we learned it. We observed, because I was on construction sites, what other people did. And within a short period of time, we could install those systems better than the state of the art at that time. Because you have people that are lazy, they're sloppy, and we were very committed to be high quality and have the best outcome we could achieve. So the whole history of the company was continuous growth. Eventually, we started to make kitchen hoods. We found some people that knew something about it. We learned from them. Then we developed our own style. We were eventually able to buy some very superior equipment, which made us more efficient, more productive. And fast forward to over a 25-year period, we became the dominant company producing commercial kitchen ventilation systems in North America. And now we're continuing to do that. We've adopted a new technology called DOAS, direct outside air systems. These are rooftop HVAC systems that can bring in fresh air from outside. Think of COVID, which is the only real solution to these buildings. So Captive Air's story of continuous growth as rapidly as we can, adopting new technologies, self-correction, and the Schumpeter not only destruction exterior, but the destruction of product line and technology has to be interior, inside the company. So you have to be willing to say, we're going to destroy our own technology and build a better technology. Those are hard steps for most companies. So I'd say it's a combination of good finance, good economic theory, very good engineering and physics, but having the instincts that are vastly different than the HVAC industry. We don't even consider ourselves part of the industry. Our goal is to recreate the industry, whereas most people in the industry are just part of the cog that does the industry every day. We don't think in those terms.
I heard you mention Joseph Schumpeter in there. How did you get introduced to economics, economic way of thinking? How did you get introduced to it, and how did you learn it?
Interesting. In college, we had probably 6 hours of economics. It was essentially Keynesian. And I didn't think it made a lot of sense, but I didn't know the right answer. So I threw that book out. And fast forward to I was about 38. I met a gentleman named William Peterson, who was a both student colleague of Luddy von Mises at NYU. And for the next 20 years, I was in adult class with Peterson. He taught me Austrian economics. He taught me about all the great economists. And I began to introduce economic concepts into Captive Air. So as an adult, online in real time, which is the way I learn most things, I learned about economics and I applied it in the company. And Peterson helped me do it. It's probably not the preferred way to do things, because most ideally, we'd at least learn those concepts in college, and then I did not. So go ahead.
What were some of those lessons that you learned from Austrian economics that you were able to apply to Captive Air?
Ronald Coase on transactional costs, theory of transactional costs. So we're fanatics at understanding costs, and now we have software to support it. But it also allowed us to project future costs with very simple formulas. So we don't have any estimating department. The senior engineer in the company and myself do all the estimating, and it takes very little time. So we figured out ways of shortcutting the process by understanding the Ronald Coase theory. Opportunity cost, obviously, is apparent every single day in everything that we do. Comparative advantage, what products do we make and what products should somebody else make? Price is a major driver within markets, and some companies will have a tendency to say, well, price doesn't really matter. Well, price actually does matter. And Peterson was an advocate to saying, look, if I had to reduce economics to a word, it would be price. So we drove the business by being a low-cost producer and concurrently producing a superior product. I'm actually just reading a book called Entrepreneurial Valuation. It's written by Mark Packard, and he is suggesting that most people get this whole idea of market valuation incorrectly. And he said it's one of the reasons why you have such higher failure rate in small business. So they evaluate based on what's in their mind, not what's in the mind of the user who's going to actually make the decision. It's a simple concept, but it's very complicated to figure out because you have to guess how's the user going to view my offering. And there's a tendency to think of, I have this amazing offering that the users will love it. Not necessarily. So our mind is locked into, and Peterson repeated this over and over, the user is the king and queen. They can be whimsical. They can change their mind in a heartbeat. You have to be very tuned into that. As a matter of fact, even today, these discussions are continuous. How will the user view our offering? How should we approach it? How can we convince them that we're providing a superior outcome when it's technically way more complicated? So if we don't educate them to what they're buying, they don't know what they're buying. And then everything looks the same, and then you lose.
I think I know from that answer what the answer to this next question is going to be, but what economic lessons were you able to apply to your approach to education?
Well, the first is we need a much higher quality offer. And the second, it needs to be done, if it's going to be done in private, it's got to be done for much lower cost. So we started off with tuition of $5,000. And that turned out to be the sweet spot. So with no help from the government, families with income as low as $65,000 could afford to get into the school. And we also would allow families to go through an outside agency. And if they couldn't pay the whole tuition, we gave them a credit for what they couldn't pay. So we used a basic economic concept there, quality at a price. And when our first school opened, we were able to remodel a building. People walked in there. It was a quality offering. It was neat, orderly, and people wanted to be there. And by the second year of the charter school, we had to start running lotteries. So my idea was, the bar is so low in public education. If we can't be higher than that bar in pleasing people, then we're pitiful. And that's the way it panned out. So cost is a big factor, quality, and deeply caring about the student, which is part of that whole value concept, that parents know that they would be safe and we care about that outcome.
I want to read here from the review of The Thales Way by Jeffrey Nelson that we published at Religion and Liberty Online, and we'll put a link to this review in the show notes for this episode. Quote, some basic commitments made at the outset of the Thales experience are relevant to this aspect of their story. High among them is that Thales schools are managed to outcomes, not inputs, as most elementary schools are. Alternatively, Thales, quote, measures success by evaluating student outcomes such as university admission, SAT or ACT test scores, school transcripts, senior theses, and quarterly teacher evaluations. Students must be able to research, think, debate, and write clearly and concisely. Luddy devotes a chapter near the end of his book to describing the, quote, 15 top outcomes of a Thales student. And he asserts Thales is unique for a lot of reasons, but its commitment to outcomes is essential. This commitment is a main reason why Thales rejected accreditation. Tell me about that decision process, because once upon a time in a different part of my professional life, I did some work for a community college in Illinois, and there was a moment where the accreditation for the community college was put under review. And I don't know that I have the words to sufficiently describe the level of crisis induced by this whole thing happening. And I see here you make this decision to reject accreditation. What went into that decision, and what was the reason for it?
The first thing on the accreditation, if you look at all these public schools are accredited, and they're accredited primarily so that they can get government money. And then if you look at the quality of students they're putting out, in many cases, highly deficient. So intuitively, I said, accreditation can't make a lot of sense. And then I heard all the stories about how schools are intimidated by accreditors. They're also opportunity costs. They're consuming time and resources with no measurable outcome. It's all inputs. So a couple of things we decided early, and part of this was from Peterson, that a school is simply a student, a parent, and a teacher. That's the three people involved. That's all a school is. So we go into the classroom. If the parents support the homework and encourage the student, if the teacher is able to stimulate the interest of the student and communicate with the parents, it's what we call the student-teacher triangle. So that's one thing that we cemented in early on. And when parents receive communication from teachers, they're really happy because they want to know how and they're surprised and they're happy. So we initiated that process early on. And then from observation, I said, well, what do we want these students to be like when they graduate? And so I started viewing many of the people that work here at Captive Air. What are the attributes that they have that make them very successful with Captive Air? And the first is what I call unfailing absolute integrity, somebody you trust. You can't have a relationship without trust, without integrity. And then I went down and basically, I like to think of everybody as a leader. Mom and dad are leaders in the home. And then in extension, everybody can have some level of leadership in the workplace. Being self-reliant, which is somewhat being destroyed today. One of the things I did early on, since I was the only one that started the company, I have to do everything. I have to be completely self-reliant. So I adopted that with our employees. As a matter of fact, one young woman, she interned with me. And then when she graduated college, she wanted to come work for me. And at the end of the first year, I said, well, how was the year? And she said, my brain hurt most of the year because I would give her assignments and say, go figure it out. If you need some help later, let me know. So going down as being a truth seeker, we are constantly seeking the truth, being a critical thinker. All these skill sets that exist in business and industry and in families are not stressed. And kind of initial sidebar, when I first did introduce it in the public school to the teachers, here's what they said. We could never make that happen. They had a little committee, and after they studied it and they were ready to present to me, and they said, we could just never make it happen. Can we take those 15 things and get them down to maybe a nice paragraph or a sentence? So I said to them, well, here's going to be the rule. You may be able to add to that 15 over time if it's approved, but you could never take anything away from those 15. And that's what we're going to do. This committee's abolished. And eventually I figured out how to do it. So even within our own school, the initial idea that we were going to focus on outcomes was completely rejected as not something we know how to do.
It really tells you something about the approach to education that, people who have come through those systems of the way that educators are educated themselves don't think about that way of, how do we make things happen that are actually outcome oriented? I lived in Chicago for about 15 years. And, one need only observe the Chicago public school system to see how they are absolutely not outcome oriented, except with the outcome of wanting to move kids on from grade to grade and eventually out of the schools. But the outcomes aren't oriented towards, do they actually have any of these skills? Can a seventh grader read at a seventh grade level? In most cases, they can't read at a fourth grade level. And you really see how that lack of orientation towards outcomes for the students has just allowed an entire educational system responsible for roughly around 350,000 kids to just disintegrate around them.
Yeah, one of the things that it's almost universal, whereas the teacher or the school says, well, we're not responsible because Johnny didn't learn how to read. It's a parental thing. It's something that's pushed all the time. Whereas in direct instruction, we take full responsibility, whether parents cooperate or not. It's our responsibility to teach the student how to read, period. Now, we hope and pray for the support of the parents, and largely that we get it. But even if we don't, it's our responsibility to teach them. And the public schools are at the whole other end. And I'll give you an example. In North Carolina, there's a law that you cannot move past the third grade unless you can do third grade reading. It's in the law. Here's what they do. They said, well, yeah, Johnny can't read in the third grade, but we're going to give him extra instruction in the summer and move him to the fourth grade. Well, he still can't read at third grade level. So even when it's embedded in law, it does not happen.
What is the relationship like between the educators in your schools and the parents? I think the answer I'm expecting to hear is that it's a good one. When I think about the orientation of a lot of those relationships, I've known people who've taught in the public school system, and I always found it interesting that I would get two different things from them. On one hand, I would hear them say, like, we really wish the parents were more involved. And when the parents got more involved, which unfortunately for a lot of these educators was to them in a negative aspect, right? So they're unhappy about something that was going on. And then they get resistant to parents being involved. And it creates this kind of adversarial relationship in a lot of schools between the parents and the teachers. Has this approach, have you seen it help to foster better and more reciprocal working relationships between the parents who, I think, myself as a parent thinking about this, I like the approach you just described, but I view educating my child as my responsibility, and I choose to enlist other people in that process because of their specialized knowledge and their ability to help do specific things better than I can. And I think for me personally, that has helped to create a better orientation of the relationship between myself and the people who teach in the schools that my kids go to. What do you see those relationships like as a result of this approach to education?
I think overall they're very positive. We get a lot of reinforcement from our parents. We get really fine information. Now, where you run into some conflicts would be discipline, where the kid tells his mom, I didn't do it, and the teacher sent him home for a day or whatever they did. Those are pretty minimal. You'll have a certain number of parents, maybe 1 in 200 that are just don't like something. For example, in the early days of Franklin Academy, some teachers and some parents decided they did not like direct instruction. And they start these rumors that direct instruction makes kids robotic. It takes the creativity out of them, and it's doing them great harm. In reality, it does the exact opposite. So we had this sort of a knockdown, drag out. Parents came and said, yeah, we really think it should be modified. So I said, well, here's the rule at the school. Direct instruction is never going to be modified. It's going to be here as long as I'm chairman, and that's for life. So if it doesn't suit you, you have to leave. This is a relatively small number of people. And actually a couple teachers and a few parents left. But once we established that this is what we do, there's a good reason why we do it, we get great results, it never came up again. And now parents realize, and even they realize that their children are excited about learning. They're proud that they've learned these things. So we don't have that problem. But if I hadn't, there's a case of saying, this is what we're going to do, and it's non-negotiable. And I give you an example. The people that I learned this from was a school in Eastern North Carolina. And about the third year after I learned it, they got a new headmaster, and the headmaster threw out direct instruction. So they took what was a really good school and it's never been good since. It's still operating, but it's not a good school. So there has to be a fine line. If you go to a doctor, you have to either believe the doctor or go to another doctor. And that's the choice of a parent. They have to make that decision. But the doctor doesn't necessarily have to change the way they operate because you don't like it. So I think we've struck a good balance. And I gave every parent my email. If you see something going on that you think is wrong, send me an email. It will get a review. And that's actually been very helpful. Maybe a teacher says something inadvertently they shouldn't have said, so you have a mid-course correction. So I think our relationship with the parents is extraordinarily good, but we can't please pass the 99 percentile. Maybe we can get to 99.5. We can't get to 100%.
Tell me about your approach and the importance of character formation in education.
Well, character formation's been important from the very beginning, but as we go along with this, character formation has to be first and most important. Because if they don't have good character, if you ever remember Bishop Sheen, he says it's better not to be educated if your character is going to be bad, because you're going to do a lot of damage. So I stress character. That includes dress code, coming on time, being respectful, trying to be a decent person. And we do have a certain number of students every year that refuse to follow the character personal development, and they get pushed out of the school. And a private school, you can do that with pretty much ease. And it doesn't take very many to get the point across. These are our standards. They're non-negotiable. And you may feel like you're an individual and you can do your own thing, but you can't do it here. So to me, character formation is first and more important than the academics, because the whole world runs on trust. And if you can't be trusted, you are not valuable in the world, period. It's certainly not emphasized. Matter of fact, the opposite is in public schools, it's whatever you can get away with. And you see evidence in our society. But if you're caught, the repercussions are severe. So what I try to emphasize, if you just do the right thing, follow the rules, life is good. life can be very, very good. Make friends, be productive. So yeah, character formation is extremely important. Cannot be overemphasized.
As we come to an end here, I have one final question for you. You have experience now with several different types of schools. So as we mentioned, Franklin Academy is a public charter school. St. Thomas More Academy is a private Catholic preparatory high school. And Thales Academy of independent pre-K through 12 schools. And as a consumer on the education side, I know there's, a whole lot of offerings out there. We looked at a bunch of different schools here in Grand Rapids before making a decision. Given your experience, these different types of schools on your side of it, what questions do you think parents as customers should be asking themselves when evaluating their educational options and trying to come to a decision on what is best for their children? What questions do you think that they should be asking?
Well, in the case of the public charter, they're going to be restricted to what the state allows them to do. So there's a limitation there. In the case of the Catholic school, they're going to be much more demanding. And in our case, the school is very rigorous, both from a character formation and academics. So for Catholic families, that would tend to be a really good choice, as opposed to the public charter. The private school, Thales, we try to hit a good balance point where we don't teach religion, but we teach values, and we support whatever religion the parents have. So I would look at the curriculum. How far are they going to get in math and science? How good of writers they are? Do they learn cursive? Well, we teach cursive, which is not taught in the public schools. Might seem like a minor deal, We teach them how to type properly, the proper way. We give them good reports. For example, when they go into high school, they're going to get a PSAT. That's going to give them some reasonable point. We use, I would look at nationally normed testing. So we use Iowa's, but you could use any number of nationally normed. How do they do on those tests? Even that you have to be careful with, because in many cases they let you correct your own tests, and that can get a little bit dicey. So you have to look at more than one data point. Students also could, in some cases, we allow students to shadow. So you could send your child to shadow for a day and just see what that experience was like. I will tell you this, that here's what parents tell me. If they move from the public school to Thales, in a short period of time where they hated to go to public school, they want to come to Thales. They're excited about coming because we're focusing on that individual. And they're learning, and when they learn, they're excited. They're happy. So I would look at kids in the school and say, are they really progressing? What's my evaluation of them at that age? But it's not the easiest thing in the world to do in terms of evaluating schools, because we tend to get into a lot of matrix that maybe make sense, maybe they don't make sense. Everything has to be questioned.
I lied to an extent. I want to ask you one more question because you brought up something that really piqued an interest in me. You hear a lot of conversation these days about standardized testing within schools, and I hear a lot more about schools wanting to move away from standardized testing. You just mentioned the Iowa test. That reminded me, because that was the one that I took when I was in elementary school. What is your view on standardized testing? How should we view it within like the greater ecosystem of the educational experience?
Well, if you look at end of grade testing, where a state, as in North Carolina, makes up their own test, I would consider it completely worthless. So I would pay no attention to it. If you look at norm testing like Iowa's, assuming it's administered correctly, it gives you some detail. Your child may be doing really well in reading, but not so well in math. So now you're aware of it from a testing standpoint. But it also points out to both the parents and the teacher deficiencies that can be worked on. So it actually has a working value. And there's I don't recall the name, there's another test that we're kind of pioneering that gives you even more details of how do you make course corrections. Now, I'll give you an example. We had some years ago, we had low scores in one of the grades, second grade. So I immediately went to the teachers and said, this is unacceptable. And of course, what they're going to tell you is, well, that particular class just wasn't as good as some of them come along. And I said, well, I'm not particularly buying that today. And that never occurred again, because they know that we're looking at the testing. We administer it as well as we can. So I found it's very, very useful. A PSAT gives you some kind of baseline. What it doesn't tell you is, does that student going to be a continuous learner? Do they have a love for learning? Do they have ingenuity? Do they have skills that are hard to define and don't come out in the test that may be more important than what's on that test? For example, there was a study done by University of Tennessee some years ago, and they said, how does C college students from average schools outperform A students from big name schools? And the central thing they came down with was that C student is a continuous learner. So they may have started behind, but at some point, 5 years down the road, they passed that other student, and then they continue to do that. So I think you have to look at more than, parents tend to think, well, if they're getting good grades, they're doing fine. To me, that doesn't mean anything. It means something, but what is the child learning? How well can they express themselves? Can they sit down and write a letter, a paragraph? Are they interested in life? And are they interested in learning? All those things I think need to be thought about more so than the things we tend to think about. My kid gets on the AB honor roll and he scored high in the standardized test. Nothing wrong with that. That's great. But there's a lot more to humans than the mechanics of learning. And if you look at, I would say I was at best an average academic learner, but a very superior informal learner. Because now I'm on my own, I'm going to dig for the truth. I'm going to find out what I need to know. I'm not going to be encumbered by the status quo whatsoever. And that ingenuity, that truth seeking is the whole basis of Captive Air, and it's the whole basis of Thales Academy.
Robert L. Luddy is the founder of Thales Academy and president and founder of Captive Air. He is the author of The Thales Way, which we've been discussing today. Bob Luddy, thank you so much for joining us today on Acton Line.
It was a privilege. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
As always, thank you for listening. Our team loves putting this podcast together for you. It's encouraging to hear from our listeners. Feedback is incredibly important to us because it lets us know what you'd like to hear more of, including the kinds of topics you're interested in most. If you have comments, feedback, or ideas for a show topic or interesting guest, you can email our team at producer@acton.org. Until next week, for Acton Line, I'm Eric Kohn.